Talking about Catholicism in 25 minutes is a great challenge. And so what I want to say is, first of all, a very introductory remark, and then trying to highlight two main points in my presentation. The introductory remark is that I'll be talking about Roman Catholicism, but I'm not thinking specifically of your Catholic friend or neighbor or family member or even yourself. There are 1.4 billion Catholics around the world, and it's not easy, if not possible, to describe the theological, spiritual reality of each one of them. I'm talking about a big picture analysis of Catholicism. If you like, a meta-narrative that shapes Roman Catholic theology and practice. And I'm talking about a framework that is characteristic of Roman Catholicism. And I'm talking about Catholicism in borrowing the language of Paul in 2 Corinthians 10, as a logismos, as a thought pattern, as a way of thinking, as a way of seeing the world. Roman Catholicism is one coin with two sides. One coin with two sides, the Roman and the Catholic. One coin, so they cannot be separated, but they are distinct faces, aspects of Roman Catholicism. And I want to suggest that there are specific challenges coming from both the Roman Catholic framework and from the Roman Catholic framework. What do I mean by this? Well, the Roman is part of the DNA of Roman Catholicism. Everything that Catholicism has to do with, in one way or another, with Rome. You cannot avoid that aspect. Yes, there is a Catholicism rooted in Cambridge, or Catholicism in the UK, yes, Catholicism in Britain, but what defines Catholicism is its relationship to Rome. The history, the traditions, the teachings, the hierarchy, the institution centered on Rome. And that's a defining mark. At the same time, Catholicism is defined by its Catholicity, its universal breadth, its claims that everything in one way or another has to find citizenship within the framework of the Roman Church. It's universal, and you see it on display if you have visited Rome, St. Peter's Square, where you see this big basilica, St. Peter's Basilica, and the cupola, Michelangelo's cupola, representing the bigness, the impressiveness, the majesty, the power of the Roman Church. And then you have the two stretched arms representing the Catholicity of the Church. They are open-ended in that they invite you to join in and to find your room, your space within the square. So I will begin by looking at the Catholic challenge coming to us, coming to our apologetic efforts, and I would summarize it in a sentence. According to the Roman Catholic meta-narrative framework, the Reformation is over. And then I'll try to give some thought on the Roman Catholic challenge coming to us that I can summarize in the sentence, the Reformation was and still is wrong. It's either over or wrong. When we think about Roman Catholicism, we should always think it through historical lenses. And one important landmark in present-day Catholicism is Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council, the latest council celebrated by the Roman Catholic Church 60 years ago. And it is through the Second Vatican Council that the previous councils, the previous pronouncements, the previous traditions need to be looked at. It is the latest council that in a way reinterprets the previous ones. And so, since Vatican II, we have seen the Catholic Church, Catholic theology, Catholic institution, Catholic agenda, etc., being shaped by the trajectories suggested by the Second Vatican Council. At the Second Vatican Council, the Roman Catholic Church repositioned itself over against the modern world, over against religions, over against the Protestant Reformation, over against humanity. No longer considering all these other players as enemies, as opponents, but seeing all these other players external, outside of the Catholic Church, as friends, allies, partners, if not brothers and sisters. That has repositioned this large historical institution away from the oppositional, confrontational outlook that resulted out of the Council of Trent, the 16th century council responding to the Protestant Reformation, and out of which the Catholic Church became oppositional, confrontational, chasing heretics, and talking about condemnations for those who would not agree with the Catholic Church, the anathemas stemming out of the Council of Trent. Vatican II had for the first time in history, was a council with no condemnations. All good words, pleasant, gentle, kind words for everyone. No one was condemned. Everyone was welcomed. Everyone was affirmed in one way or another. And since then, the Catholic Church, globally speaking, has become very Catholic. Protestants were considered to be heretics. At Vatican II, began to be thought of as being separated brethren, family language. John Paul II, in the 1992 encyclical Ut Unum Sint on ecumenism, spoke of Protestants as retrieved brethren. Pope Francis went even further in 2020 in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, all brothers, extending that language of brotherhood to the whole of humanity. That is Vatican II theology. According to Vatican II, not only Protestants became separated brethren, but Muslims became to be considered people with whom we pray to the same God, and we worship the same God. That's Vatican II. And even people of goodwill, no longer being considered outside of the scope of the church and outside of the scope of grace, but being considered in one way or another, mysteriously so, ordered, designed to the people of God in one way or another. The difference was no longer between being in or out. The difference became the intensity, the degrees of closeness or furthest. Catholic Church became ecumenical. It used to be very against the ecumenical movement. It has become now perhaps the most impactful and energetic player in the global ecumenical movement. The Catholic Church has become the promoter of inter-religious dialogue, not only in the understanding dialogue as dialogue, that is, a discourse between two or more players discussing things, but understanding dialogue as a way of expressing and promoting brotherhood, fellowship, unity. Vatican II was the child of this anxiety for unity. And Vatican II was the time when the concerns, not only of the Reformation, but also of the modern world, were no longer discredited or rejected, but were, in one way or another, absorbed. And then, in the 60s, the charismatic movement also became a reality within the Catholic Church, and now is one of the thriving lay movements within the Roman Church. Very different picture than, say, 100 years ago. But a picture that has consistently sent out the message that the issues that characterized our conversations with Rome across the centuries are, at best, outdated, out-fashioned, of no, if not little, significance. Rome has allowed the circulation of the Bible in the vernacular languages. Rome has affirmed the importance of the laity. Rome has even got to the point of signing a kind of agreement on the doctrine of justification by faith with the Lutherans and followed by other communions. What's the point of going back to the Reformation? Why not working together? Why not worshiping together? Why not walking together? Why not praying together? Why not doing missions together? Why not evangelizing together? In terms of post-Vatican II Catholicism, our differences have become an historical footnote. But the main text has changed. Only if you want to be studious and want to go into details, then you have to go to the footnotes. But if you're not a scholar, if you're not interested in the details, you can remain within the main text and you will not miss anything important. To the point that the same message has gone not only over evangelical Protestants, but also with Eastern Orthodox, liberal Protestants, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, different ways, different languages, different intensities, but the same framework: unity, Catholicity, embracement. And there is a sense in which that is the kind of mainstream Roman Catholicism that we're dealing with in many parts of the world. Because out of Vatican II, priests have been trained along the lines of the teachings promoted by Vatican II. Seminaries are teaching this kind of theology. We're all one, we're brothers. What's the point? Why do we keep on raising issues that are outdated? The Reformation is over. And then there is the Roman Catholic challenge. On the other hand, one coin, two faces, two sides, which at the same time, coming from the same framework, coming from the same reality, tells a very different message. Keeps on rehearsing the message that has been prevalent after the Council of Trent. The Reformation is wrong, was wrong, and is wrong. Now, this is not mainstream in Roman Catholicism, and I guess that in your daily ministry, in universities, in churches, in evangelism, you will more often find Roman Catholics in the Catholic mood, saying, okay, that's good, but what's the point? We're all circling around the same faith, traditions, beliefs, and one way or another, there's room for everybody. St. Peter's Square is large enough to accommodate different groups, different people in different places. If you want to stay closer to the Basilica, that's fine. You are a practicing, consistent Catholic. If you want to be on the right-hand side, there is room there. If you want to be on the left-hand side, there is room. If you want to be further, there is room for you. Actually, the door is open for people to come and go. The aim of the Roman Catholic challenge is no longer to convert you to Catholicism. Of course, if you then want to become a Roman Catholic, that's good for you. But the end result, the end goal is not to make the world a Roman Catholic in the sense of everybody becoming a practicing Catholic. The goal is to appreciate the unity that we already have. And the Catholic Church is the sacrament of unity between God and mankind, a sign and instrument of the unity that already exists between God and mankind, so that the unity that we already have will become even experienced in a fuller way. That's Lumen Gentium 1, the first programmatic, most important document of the Second Vatican Council. This type of Catholics will not want to convert you, but will have you think that the issues at stake brought about by the Reformation are no longer of primary importance. It's a matter of, do you like pizza with mozzarella cheese or without? It's not a decisive issue. It's an important issue, especially if you come from my country, but not a decisive one. You can eat a pizza without mozzarella and still survive and still enjoy it. Not so for the Roman Catholic challenge that comes to us. There are sectors within Catholicism that are still operating within a framework whereby Vatican II has not been really grasped or accounted for. It is more considered as an accident of the long historical trajectory of the Catholic Church, but what really counts is the pronouncements, the beliefs, the devotions, the magisterium that has resulted out of the Council of Trent, Vatican I, the recent Marian dogmas, 1854 dogma of the Immaculate Conception, the 1870 dogma of papal infallibility, and the 1950 dogma of Mary's bodily assumption into the heavenly glories. They are more intensely rooted in this Roman tradition, wanting people to convert, wanting people to turn away from their religions or paths and become Roman Catholic. That's a tendency that is to be found within the Roman Catholic Church, not the mainstream one. Although it has become very vocal in recent years through the work of online apologists, defenders of the Catholic Church, giving the idea that it's either or. You either become a Catholic or you are wrong, if not lost. The attitude is oppositional, confrontational, and the aim is to convert you. And perhaps you have found in your experience, and you have experience of dealing with Roman Catholics who want to convert you. These are more rooted in the Roman Catholic mindset. The two sides coexist in the one coin. It's not one coin having one face, but having two faces. And so it is important for us to be aware of what is going on in this big world of Roman Catholicism. Usually speaking, these Catholic apologists, they do have a selective view of Catholicism. They choose not to look at the last 60, 70 years. And that's not really Roman Catholic. It's a living tradition. You cannot pick and choose what you like. It's either you pick the whole of it, or you are selectively choosing what fits most with your prejudice. And it is also an idealized and at times an intellectualized version of Catholicism, thinking that Catholicism is mainly driven by texts and mainly driven by doctrines. Now, the flesh of Catholicism, of course, has codes, texts, pronouncements, but the flesh of Catholicism has to do with tradition, imaginary, shaping social memory, family ties. Normally, these Catholic apologists, they want you to believe that Catholicism is a set of doctrines that were defined before Vatican II. And you need to stick to them. It's an idealized and selective view of Catholicism, wanting to send the message that the Reformation was a new development, unprecedented, having brought about shallow practices, superficial worship, and having resulted in a poorer intellectual tradition. So if you want to have the best, the original, the only tradition out of which Protestantism has fallen out, you must go back to Rome. By the way, that was also the view of Pope Francis when he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires in 1985, writing about Protestantism as the source of all evils. The source of all evils, nihilism, totalitarian regimes, ideological suicides, all stemming from the tragedy of Luther nailing the 95 Theses. And even more so, the tragedy of Calvin beheading, that's the word that Bergoglio used, beheading beheading the people away from the Father, beheading the people away from the church, beheading the people away from society. So, either the Reformation is over or the Reformation was wrong. Now, the ultimate point, the ultimate issue is not the Reformation, of course. We're not here to defend the Reformation as such. We're not here to be apologists of the Reformation as an historical event. The Reformation made many mistakes and had many weaknesses. The point is deeper than an historical one. The point has to do with the Reformation account of the gospel. And this is what actually is at stake here. Was and is the Reformation account of the gospel the biblical gospel, or the account of the gospel that is closer to the gospel, that is ultimately the gospel? Or is the Protestant account of the Reformation only a variant among many others, and you can pick and choose what suits you most? In responding to these challenges, we have to make sure that we're not defenders of the Reformation as such, but we are defenders of the biblical gospel to which the Reformation tried to bear witness to. And that biblical gospel has to do with the recognition of the lordship of the triune God as it is expressed in the recognition of the supremacy of the Word of God written in all matters of life and faith, as the supreme voice by which the Lord guides the church, the ultimate authority for the church to follow. That issue is central to receive the gospel in a faithful way and to preach it faithfully. And it also has to do with the recognition that salvation is a gift that comes from outside of us, not something that we already have at work in us. And the gospel kind of elevates it to a second stage or superior stage. It is a gift that comes to us, accomplished by the finished work of Christ and received by the empty hand of faith in being united with Christ and filled with the Holy Spirit. And it is in Christ alone, the only one who is the God-man and who is living today and is totally capable of mediating between us and the Father. This is the issue that Roman Catholicism is challenging, both from the Catholic view, whereby these issues are over, and the Roman view, whereby these issues are wrong. So my encouragement is to continue to be faithful to the biblical gospel that our forefathers and foremothers at the Reformation were faithful to in their weaknesses and sins, but ultimately wanting to receive and respond to the gospel in a faithful way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leonardo, and thank you to all of you for being with us. It is a pleasure for me and my wife, Jennifer, to be among you and to spend this time together thinking about the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. Leonardo began by saying that it's difficult to summarize Roman Catholicism in 25 minutes or so. And I would like to echo that and say, and you should remember, Roman Catholicism is much, much, much more like Protestantism than Eastern Orthodoxy is. In fact, one of the things that is really helpful in thinking about and interacting with Eastern Orthodoxy is to recognize that in your mind, they look similar. Roman Catholicism and Orthodoxy look similar. The architecture of the churches may seem fairly similar. The prominence of icons and relics, the priestly robes, the ceremonies, to an outsider like us Protestants, those may look very similar. They aren't. They aren't similar. The way Eastern Orthodoxy conceives of the Christian life is dramatically different from both Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. And so if I were going to try to talk about Eastern Orthodoxy in 25 minutes or so, it would be much harder even than the monumental task that it would have been for Leonardo to talk about Roman Catholicism. So I'm not going to do that. I'm not even going to try to do that at big picture level, although I have tried to do that in terms that Protestants can understand in one of my books called Eastern Orthodoxy Through Western Eyes, if anybody is interested in that book. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the formative history of Eastern Orthodoxy, as Leonardo talked about the recent history of Roman Catholicism. I will talk about that this afternoon in my seminar. It's not what I want to do now with all of you. Instead, I would like to do this. I would like to do three things this afternoon. The first thing is that I would like to talk about ways that Eastern Orthodoxy is attractive to people today. As we see a new turning to spirituality today, and some of the people who are turning to spirituality are turning to Eastern Orthodoxy, what is it about this very strange expression of Christianity that they find attractive? So that's the first thing I'd like to talk about. And that, I hope, will give us some things to think about in our own ministries. The second thing I'd like to do, and what I want to place the most emphasis on, is what is it about the biblical gospel that is not clear in Eastern Orthodoxy? That's the main thing that I want to focus on. And the second thing. And then the third thing I want to do is to try to summarize what I've said by suggesting what exactly is the better good news of Protestantism, expressed in a way that I have found to be helpful with Eastern Orthodox people. Now, you may not minister to Eastern Orthodox people. You may not minister to people who are interested in Eastern Orthodoxy. But as I think you will see, the sorts of things that attract people to Eastern Orthodoxy are also the sorts of things that influence the people in our Anglo-American societies and other societies today that you're ministering with. So even if you never directly interact with Eastern Orthodoxy, I hope that what I'll say at the end will be of some value. So 3 things. Why is Eastern Orthodoxy attractive? What is not clear about the gospel in Eastern Orthodoxy? And third, what's a way of talking about the better good news that I've found to be helpful? So number 1, why is Eastern Orthodoxy attractive to people today? I'd like to suggest 5. There are lots of reasons, but let me briefly suggest 5 of these. First, in a post-literate society, and I want you to let that sink in, because we evangelical Protestants are avowedly people of the book. But if you haven't noticed, we live in a post-literate society today, a society that doesn't read. I sometimes challenge my students, Christians need to be the last people who can follow an argument that lasts more than half a page. We need to be the last people who can read a long book all the way through. I make my students read The City of God in its entirety. It's only 1,100 pages. You need to be able to read long books, to follow long arguments. We live in a society that is not that. In a post-literate society, Eastern Orthodoxy is attractive because it is a less text-based form of Christianity than Western Christianity, and especially than Protestantism. Brad was talking this morning about Augustine's conversion as described in Book 8 of the Confessions, and he encouraged you to read it, and I encourage you to read it. The most famous thing of that description is when he hears a child playing some game off to the side, and the child says, "Take up and read." And he immediately takes his Bible, he opens it to Romans chapter 13, he reads, and his life is transformed. And in a sense, Augustine gave the Western Christian world its paradigm for meaning. You find meaning by wrestling it out of a text. That's less true of Roman Catholicism than it is of Protestantism. It's not true at all of Eastern Orthodoxy. And because we live in a non-literate, post-literate society, people are attracted to a version of Christianity that is self-consciously following the admonition, not take up and read, but look up and see. It's very visual, very, very visual. And that's attractive to people today. It's also a challenge for us as Protestants. How are we going to be faithful to our most fundamental conviction that the truth is found in this text, testifying to Jesus Christ, who is the truth, in a society that doesn't look for texts or look for truth anymore? That's one way that orthodoxy is attractive. A second, in a society which is fractured and rootless, and I don't think I have to convince you that our society is fractured and rootless, Eastern Orthodoxy claims to have roots in an unbroken tradition from the apostles to the present. One of the 2 things that all Eastern Orthodox people know to say to Protestants is this: Eastern Orthodoxy has never needed a reformation because it has never departed from the truth. Parentheses. The other thing they know to say is, we don't worship the icons, we just honor them. But that's a question for another day. Eastern Orthodoxy has never needed a reformation because it has never departed from the truth. In my very strong opinion, this is propaganda. It is very, very powerful propaganda, but it doesn't hold up to any kind of historical scrutiny. The line from the apostles to any present-day Christian tradition is a bit convoluted. And that is no less true of Eastern Orthodoxy than it is of Protestantism, or any of the branches of Protestantism. I'll talk more about that in my seminar this afternoon for anybody who is interested. But it is very powerful propaganda to say, we've always been the same. We've always been faithful. We've never departed. You should join us. And that is attractive to people who are rootless and looking for stability. A third way in which Eastern Orthodoxy is attractive is that in a society that has drunk too deeply from rationalism, Eastern Orthodoxy is unashamedly mystical and conscious of the sacred. This morning in what Dan was saying, he talked about the way that we have drunk too deeply from rationalism. But one of the things that I think was very important about what Dan said was that we have not become demystified or disenchanted. We have been trained to think of ourselves as disenchanted. We are not actually rational, but we have grown used to thinking of ourselves as being rational and rationalistic. That's part of the way we think about ourselves. But for the people who genuinely feel there's more to it than cold rationalism, the mysticism of Eastern Orthodoxy is very attractive. Western Christianity works very hard to produce rational answers. So what exactly is the presence of Christ in the Lord's Supper, for example? Eastern Orthodoxy waves away such questions. That's for you rationalists. One of the greatest Eastern Orthodox theologians of the 20th century went so far as to distinguish between the living God of the Bible and the God of philosophers and scholars. And he said, you Westerners, we are worshiping the God of philosophers and scholars, not the living God of the Bible. Now, that's not true. But again, it's powerful propaganda. So the mysticism of Eastern Orthodoxy, the fact that it is avowedly supernatural and non-rational or supra-rational, is something that's very attractive to a lot of people. Number 4, in a society that has turned against the West, Eastern Orthodoxy claims correctly to be non-Western and is proud of its cultural and national heritage, not ashamed of it. This relates to what we were talking about this morning, the defeat of the strong gods. The West, especially Western academia, has been trying to banish the strong gods. Eastern Orthodoxy is proud of its strong God. It is proud of its heritage. It is proud of its nationalism in a way that is attractive to people. When we look around us, when people look around themselves and they see that in the academic world, in the halls of the great university towns like Cambridge and that other place, and a couple of places in the States and Europe as well, when we look at what's happening there, we see it as being almost entirely destructive. And so we are looking, or people are looking for a tradition, a religious tradition that is proud of its history, proud of the civilizations it has built, not ashamed of them, not trying to tear them down, not trying to reject them. And so a Christianity that hasn't been a part of this massive Western intellectual effort at deconstruction is attractive to people. And number 5, and this is going to be perhaps the toughest one for us as Protestants to swallow, in a religious environment saturated by ease, by convenience, by a consumer mentality, Eastern Orthodoxy is unashamedly demanding, offering a hard road to God, that appeals to many people. An Eastern Orthodox reaction to one of my books went like this: it's okay to be in the army, but not everybody can be a Green Beret. Now, if I understand correctly, the British equivalent to the Green Berets is the Ranger Regiment. It's a branch of the Special Forces, a higher level, an elite corps within the American Army called the Green Berets. I think the Ranger Regiment is the equivalent in the UK. Sure, you can be a soldier. But if you want to be a real athlete for Christ, if you want to be a Green Beret, if you want to be in the Special Forces, then you need to join Eastern Orthodoxy. And believe it or not, that appeals to a lot of young people who are tired of convenience and tired of ease and are taking up the call to do hard things with their lives. And Eastern Orthodoxy appeals to them. So once again, to summarize these 5 ways in which I think Eastern Orthodoxy is attractive. Number 1, in a post-literate society, Eastern Orthodoxy is less text-based than Western Christianity. Number 2, in a fractured, rootless society, Eastern Orthodoxy claims to have an unbroken tradition from the apostles to the present. Number 3, in a society that has drunk too deeply from rationalism, Eastern Orthodoxy is unabashedly mystical and conscious of the sacred. Number 4, in a society that is turned against the West, Eastern Orthodoxy claims to be non-Western and is proud of its cultural and national heritage, not ashamed of it. And then number 5, in a religious environment saturated by ease and convenience, Eastern Orthodoxy is unashamedly demanding, offering a hard road to God that appeals to many. So as I look at the situation, these are some of the reasons that I think Eastern Orthodoxy is attractive. And I offer them to you just for us to think about. If that's part of what is drawing people to the spiritual, what might we need to say? What do we need to do in that kind of context? But that's not the main thing I want to do this afternoon. The main thing, the second thing, and the main thing is I want to talk about is what is not very clear in Eastern Orthodoxy. What is it that is very central to the biblical gospel that people are not going to get or are unlikely to get or to hear in Eastern Orthodox churches? And I'd like to talk about 3 of these essential aspects of the gospel, which I think we are uniquely positioned to be able to explain to people clearly. So first of all, what is not clear in Eastern Orthodoxy? First of all, that God's longing for us is personal and relational. That God's longing for us is personal and relational. This morning we talked a lot about sin, and very helpfully about sin, and reminded ourselves of the problem, the barrier that sin creates. Recognize that in society as a whole, sin is often not felt at the level of my moral culpability. It is felt at the level of its result. And what is its primary result? Alienation. So people who may not realize it's my fault still realize I am adrift. I am alone. I am alienated. My only contact with people comes through machines and screens. Is that really what it was meant to be? And so the truth that God's purposes for people are fundamentally personal and relational is one of the most essential aspects of the good news of our Lord Jesus Christ. As Glenn was talking about this morning, think about the parable of the prodigal son, and the prodigal son comes back and he's ready just to be a hired hand, a slave in his father's house. And his father doesn't even let him finish the sentence before taking him back as his son. And I don't believe Glenn mentioned this, but how does that parable end? The father speaking to the other brother and saying, this person who was dead and is now alive, who is lost and now saved, is your brother. Your brother. The relational purposes of God for people lie at the very center of the story of Scripture. In the new heaven and new earth, what will be fulfilled? Ultimately, the promise, I will be their God, and they will be my people. Oddly enough, that comes through very poorly in modern Eastern Orthodoxy, in my strong opinion. The mysticism, the spirituality of modern Eastern Orthodoxy is a strangely impersonal one for reasons that I'm going to try to explain in my seminar this afternoon. It is more about a sense of the numinous divine presence than it is about being a daughter or a son to the Father of the universe. One of the most important things that people need to hear in their alienation and loneliness is that you're not alone. And the God who created you longs to bring you back into his family. And we are uniquely positioned to be able to explain that. So, a second thing that is missing or very underemphasized in modern Eastern Orthodoxy. Everything that is necessary for God to accept you back to himself, he has already done. He has already done it. He has already done it. As Glenn was saying this morning, it's not an Adam-Moses contrast. It is an Adam-Christ contrast. That does not come through very clearly at all in modern Eastern Orthodoxy, even though, in my opinion, it does come through clearly in the early Greek fathers. And I'll talk about that on Monday for those of you who will join us for that event. That doesn't come through at all well in modern Orthodoxy. The downside of offering people the hard road to God is that it's hard for you to explain the indispensable and completed work of God that precedes any action on our part whatsoever. I have a confession to make. I once planted a question in the classroom of a Greek Orthodox professor. I had a student of mine who was taking a class at Holy Cross in the United States, Greek Orthodox institution, and he was taking a class from a very well-known Greek patristic scholar, somebody whose work is quite good and that has been helpful to me. So I told the student, go ask the professor, what's the difference between these two sentences? God became man to bring us to himself versus God became man to enable us to rise up to him. God became man to bring us to himself, or God became man to enable us to rise up to him. As I knew would happen, the professor ranted and raved and hemmed and hawed for a few minutes and said, those are the same thing. I don't think those are the same thing at all. I don't think those are remotely the same thing. Because an essential aspect of the gospel is that God has already done everything necessary to bring us to himself. And we are uniquely positioned to make that clear. A third thing that is essential to the biblical gospel that I think is substantially missing or underemphasized in Eastern Orthodoxy is this. Everything about Christian spirituality flows from God's acceptance. It does not lead to it. The hard road to God is the road walked by those who have already been made his children. who have already been declared righteous in his sight, who already belong to him, and who, out of joy and anticipation and maybe some duty mixed in there as well, seek to honor the God who has saved them. Notice that when you talk about the gospel in familial terms, when you talk about the gospel with relational imagery, that becomes crystal clear. You have been brought into God's family. Now act like the child of God that you are. There's no ambiguity about whether those actions are the basis for your acceptance to God, because you've already been declared a child of God. The more relationally we talk about the gospel, the clearer it is that our acceptance before God begins Christian life. It does not conclude Christian life. Think for a moment about 1 John chapter 3, verses 1 through 3. Look, what manner of love the Father has bestowed upon us, that we should be called children of God. Next line, and that is what we are. Then and only then does John go on to say, and look at his coming. And when he comes, we will be like him. We are his children. We will one day be like him. That order is absolutely crucial to the gospel. And it is, unfortunately, not always clear and not often clear in Eastern Orthodoxy. So, the second big thing I'm trying to do, what are three things about the biblical gospel that are not so clear in Eastern Orthodoxy? The first, that God's longing for us is personal and relational. The second is that God has already done everything that is needed to bring us to himself. And the third is that Christian spirituality flows from God's acceptance rather than being the prerequisite for that acceptance. So in conclusion, what is the better news that we are uniquely able to offer? I suggest we say it something like this: God's only Son has become our brother, so that we might be his brothers and sisters, and therefore the daughters and sons of his Father. God's only Son has become our brother, so that we might be his brothers and sisters, and therefore the daughters and sons of his Father. And then secondly, God himself is ready to accept you now. Not tomorrow, not in a year, not in a century, not in a million years. Now. Now. Of course, what I've just described is justification by grace through faith alone. But I've described it in a way that I have found, using words that I have found to be helpful in reaching people who are influenced by Eastern Orthodoxy. And whether you're working with Eastern Orthodox people, or people influenced by Orthodoxy, or people who are attracted to Orthodoxy, or simply people who share some of the same general sentiments that attract people to Orthodoxy, I suggest that these ways of talking about things, focusing on the relational family aspects of the gospel and focusing on God's acceptance now, can be helpful in our ministries. Thank you very much.
Brilliant presentations. Just a few things. I think the importance of what we hear and how we are heard. One of Leo's books is Same Words, Different Worlds. And I think it's not doing either Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy a disservice to say that these are worldviews. They're not kind of, piecemeal, atomistic that you can pick things from. They are whole ways of viewing the world. And that means that the words can look very similar, because I'm thinking on the Roman Catholic side, Roman Catholics would say they believe in justification by faith, they believe in Christ, they believe in, the Bible. But the key thing is the alone bit, which does make all the difference. So I think we have to recognize that, to say that we can be hearing very similar words, but we are talking about whole different ways of viewing the world. And that's why I think, when I was talking this morning about religious consciousness, the way that we kind of suppress the truth and substitute it for other things, that battle of religious consciousness and the gospel always goes on. And you might think, well, this is so sectarian. But, the three things that Don just laid out there, those three things in the middle, that is the gospel. So it is saying that the gospel is missing from these two amazing, capacious, philosophically sophisticated traditions. But I think that's important. The key thing is alone. And when I get, my PhD supervisor was a very conservative Catholic. We've had so many discussions over the years. We've written stuff together. We did a book together. And at the end of the day, from the Roman Catholic side, the thing we in some ways personally became closer, but the biggest thing that we realized separated us, when it boiled down to it, from all the other things that we could say we disagreed on, it was basically the doctrine of sin. The difference between wounded nature and depraved nature. And I do think that's at the heart of the differences. Even in, it was interesting listening to Leo on his podcast recently talk about the papal encyclical on AI. Some of it's very helpful, but it is a very different anthropology. The starting point is very different. How we hear and how we are heard. And sometimes how we are heard, and I'm going to say this as a theological educator for a long time now, this is why theology is so important. Because we need to know, how do we give the best, not caricature of Protestantism, but what is really the case? I've spoken to so many Roman Catholics who say, you Protestants, I wouldn't want to be a Protestant because it's just complete anarchy. There's no authority. Everyone, you can interpret the Bible however you want to. But of course, we know that there's a difference between what we might say solo scriptura, which was much more a part of, say, the radical Reformation, and the magisterial tradition of sola scriptura. We're not denying the ministerial authority of tradition or experience. We are recognizing the magisterial authority of Scripture. So people are wandering around with lots of caricatures about what they think Protestantism and the gospel is, and we need to do our work and to give the best kind of argument. And then finally to say, it's just amazing. I mean, all of these challenges that have been laid out for both Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, these are such great opportunities. I mean, I know that Leo's done a little bit, and I know I go on about the same stuff all the time. But, the magnetic points, subversive fulfillment, all of these are really helpful in using as a tool to help us understand where our Catholic brothers and sisters and our Eastern Orthodox brothers and sisters are coming from. And, the way that Don laid out those 5 points, it's amazingly attractive. You can see why people are there. But that's a point of contact for us, to be able to contextualize appropriately, and that is the work of missiology. So I think they're just some reflections, great challenges, great opportunities. If you get confused by all of this, for me, I just come back to, is it grace alone, faith alone, Christ alone, to God's glory alone, Scripture alone? And that, for me, boils down to the differences between both of these different worlds. So there you go. Thank you.
Lovely talks. And isn't it great to, as we think about engaging with other faith positions, doesn't it help your own faith, actually? I find that whether it's talking to Catholics or Orthodox or Muslims or people from other religions, you get to sort of taste and see the difference with Jesus in a beautiful way. And I think you've helped us to do that. I think I am encountering lots of people through the YouTube space, especially, who are very interested in Orthodoxy or Catholicism in the abstract, because they've fallen down a YouTube hole. They've wound up in a church that might look like this, and they're expecting something really quite high church, And probably what happens on a Sunday at Christ Church here in Cambridge is similar to what happens in my church in Eastbourne, which is very low church evangelical. And they are instantly sort of, oh, I should have probably gone to the Orthodox Church because they don't speak a language that anybody's spoken for 1,000 years, and I'll stand up for 3 hours. But actually, we say the Lord's Prayer together, we do stand for the creeds, we do have the Lord's Supper, and that's actually enough tradition for them. Because the comparison between a sort of an evangelical church and the Orthodox Church in their imagination is kind of vast, but the difference between scrolling on Instagram and coming to your church, that's the difference that you need to get them across. And actually doing things that are grounded, that are rooted in history, that are challenging and embodied and strange and sacramental and liturgical. Protestants have that too. Like it's not as though we hive off all of that to the traditional denominations. We ought to have that kind of thing. And even if you just sing a creed or say the Lord's Prayer together, that is often enough tradition for the sort of seeker who's been awakened by online things. I loved, Donald, what you said about how, the personal love of God and the accomplished work of Christ and the Christian life flowing from acceptance is the heart, therefore, of our position on justification. And it is because we believe that God is love, the Father loving his Son in the joy of the Spirit, and that God the Son has become God our brother to make us his children, that by the Spirit we call on the same Father with the same Abba. That Trinitarian Adam and Christ, union with Christ gospel, I wrote 3-2-1 to do that, and my hero for the 3 was Athanasius, right? And my hero for the 2 was Irenaeus. And my hero for the 1 was kind of John Calvin and union with Christ. But what do you notice about these guys? The ancient Eastern, we are not saying don't be rooted in the history. We're not saying don't be as challenging and theological. We're not saying don't look for the mystical and the enchanted. We're saying there are riches here that have been lost and that can be recovered. And so to the Orthodox, we're kind of saying, actually, I think the gospel that Athanasius preached and I think the gospel that Irenaeus preached is the kind of gospel you'll hear in this low church evangelical Anglican church here in Eastbourne, here in Cambridge. So be more Orthodox in that sense, right? Be truly Orthodox in that sense. Be truly Catholic, truly universal, right? Not Roman. What do you notice about Roman Catholic? You brought out brilliantly the contradiction, the two sides of things. We're universal, and that's the Pope. And there is a contradiction. And I think, Gavin Ortland is doing a great job, I think, online of telling a lot of people who have woken up to Catholic apologetics to say, oh, you can be far more universal than being Roman Catholic. You can be truly universal when you, and I'll finish with this, the point that Brad made earlier, the triumph of Augustine's doctrine of justification over Augustine's doctrine of the church. I think as you center the church on the doctrine of justification, you start to be truly universal. When you depart from that, you learn, you lose both justification and the church. Anyway.
For my personal conversations, I would like to know when, how, and why did the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church start to depart from the model of how a church is run from the New Testament, being the way that you have this mediator to Jesus through the priest. Also in the buildings, these separations, a lot of it reminds me on the Jewish temple. So like that the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church didn't take their model from the New Testament, but from the Jewish temple. So why, how, when did that start? That would be helpful for me to know.
You want to answer that in Orthodoxy? Officially, the saints are not mediators. Officially, they're not placing other mediators between God and us. Officially, those are intercessors. And to ask the saints to pray for you is the same thing as asking a living believer to pray for you. That's what's going on officially. Unofficially, though, in popular Orthodoxy and probably in popular Roman Catholicism as well, that's where you begin to get the idea of the Father, Son, and Spirit is distant, and you need somebody closer, Mary or the other saints. So this is one of the places where the difference between what the theologians are saying and what the lay people believe, or even what the priests believe, is quite dramatic. The Orthodoxy at its worst is the gap between that and Orthodoxy at its best is much greater, in my opinion, than is the case in Protestantism.
When was the follow-up? When sort of did this emerge? I think is.
When? I'm sorry. Is that the question? Yeah. You start getting a lot of attention to the martyrs as early as the 2nd century. You begin to see some distance in the popular perception between Christ as mediator and other intercessors turning into mediators as early as the 4th century. So it goes back a long way. It's not just a medieval development.
Thanks, Don. I think we'll come to another question over here, and we'll save some follow-ups for later. Thank you.
Thank you, Leo. Sorry. And thank you, Don. Quick question for Leo. You've mentioned all the changes that have happened since Vatican II, some encouraging, some not, distribution of Bibles, but lots of syncretism. Are you broadly encouraged that Catholicism might inch towards biblical orthodoxy, or are you discouraged that it'll probably unravel into liberalism? And a quick 15 seconds question for Don. Do you think we should recover some of the numinous nature of worship in our churches, or is that simply window dressing?
Well, in terms of post-Vatican II trends,
Some of the humanists.
there's been an explosion of different trajectories, not only in the more biblical evangelical type, but on all fronts. So Marian trajectories, social, liberal trajectories, and so Catholicism has become more Catholic, and so even more difficult to think of a possible renewal Reformation movement from within, given the fact that it has opened up to all kinds of trajectories. So far, the Roman institution has been able to maintain a certain stability, not without problems. There are crises going on and tensions, but the framework has been built in such a way as to be able to maintain those tensions without radically changing anything. So I'm not optimistic, but God is sovereign.
And Don. Sorry, the follow-up question for Don.
The numinous. Should we be recapturing something of the numinous?
Okay, yeah, I don't have anything to add.
Okay, fine.
Great. Thanks, Don. Next one over here. Thank you.
To ask Leonardo, and maybe the others as well, I can see the appeal of the unity and talk about the brethrenship that the Catholic side of Roman Catholicism talks about. Is that something Protestants should learn from? And how should we be countering that as well? Because obviously Muslims and Christians don't worship the same God.
Well, certainly the appeal to unity is something that flows from the gospel. And so if it's gospel unity, yes, 100%, and even more so. And if we have failed to honor the mandate to be one, flowing out of the gospel, that is our problem. The fact is that with Catholicism, we're not talking about the biblical unity. We're talking about an institutionalized, sacramental type of unity that is not what biblical unity is all about. So again, is an example of same words, different worlds. And I will explain it more thoroughly in my seminar, especially on this very important word, buzzword, unity, that has become the word of the generation. We want to be one. We want to be united. But the question is, what kind of unity are we looking for? Is it a unity driven by an institution or driven by a different account of the gospel? Or is it the unity that Jesus prayed for in John 17?
Anton?
Yes, related to that, Leo used two really important words there, institution and sacrament. In Roman Catholicism, I think the unity is understood institutionally and sacramentally. In Eastern Orthodoxy, it's understood almost completely sacramentally. In Protestantism, it's understood spiritually. Our union with Christ and our union with one another go together. And part of what lies behind that is Wycliffe's understanding of the invisible church. And I go so far as to say in class that without the understanding of the invisible church, the Reformation couldn't have happened. So that's really integral as the background to the Reformation. So we need to be asking, what does it look like for us to manifest the unity that we have with each other because we are united to Christ, rather than assuming somebody else's definitions of the word unity?
Great stuff. We got one down here, Peter, your row.
So to what extent do we need to update our assumptions from maybe an older style, seeker-sensitive, make everything as comfortable as possible, to maybe appealing to some of these things that you've identified in terms of the desire for challenge and for mystery and for history and so on? How might that inform our evangelism and apologetics?
I think the post-war boiled-down evangelical evangelism, which was bring people to Yankee Stadium, get Billy Graham to preach, a gospel that is kind of a bridge diagram, and let's cut through every single denominational difference that there could possibly be, and I think that had been what evangelism has been for 80 years. And I think what we're now returning to is more normal. Like the fact that people are asking me about the Filioque clause, and I think that they already are Christian, and no, they've just watched a lot of YouTube. And they're coming with denominational questions, like right at the heart of things, and they're coming with a desire for church and sacrament and liturgy, and they'll dive in on a Sunday rather than have to go to Yankee Stadium on a Tuesday evening. And in a sense, I think that's a return to normal. I think what we've had post-war has been the blip. I think that's been the unnatural thing. We're returning to what's much more normal, which is to talk about denominations, and it is to talk about the distinctives of your gospel versus the Roman Catholic gospel. I think it would mean for us a re-privileging of Sunday morning and Lord's Day worship, and my argument would be weekly communion. My argument would be do not deprivilege the sacraments, and don't try to lowest common denominator everything. Don't lead your services with, what we're going to do now, we're going to just talk to God. It's a thing called prayer. It might spook you a little bit. Don't worry, you don't need to do that. I mean, certainly our Catholic and Orthodox friends are not doing that in their churches, and they're not losing people at the moment for being very granular and very crunchy in their denominational distinctives. So why shouldn't we be just as proud of our denominational distinctives?
Dan?
Yeah, just say, I think missiologically, sorry, I need a, I've got a thing, sorry.
I brought my own mic.
Missiologically, syncretism is not good. The gospel does not accommodate to anything, but contextualization is good. And it's great. One of the amazing things about unity and diversity is that the gospel doesn't inhabit only one culture, only one ethnicity, only one way of doing things. But the gospel doesn't accommodate. I mean, Andrew Walls, the very famous missiologist, did this great article, you can find it online, The Gospel as Both Prisoner and Liberator of Culture. And I think that kind of, now of course, sometimes you're taking risks. I think when Paul in Acts 17 starts quoting from their poets, I think he's taking a risk about how, but that is what authentic contextualization is like. And so I think, that these are some of the things that we have to work through. And again, it's things that have often been the case in a much more ordinary cross-cultural missionary setting. We need to be applying those kinds of tools to our post-Western, post-secular situation.
Great, thank you. We've got another question over here.
Yeah, in my experience as a pastor, I'm happy to talk about the gospel as absolutely primary, and how Rome and the Eastern Orthodoxy has departed from the gospel, and therefore we can't have fellowship with them because they, I would say, aren't Christians if they hold to what Rome or the Eastern Orthodoxy teach. But I'm finding within my church there are people less prepared to say that, less prepared to see that the gospel, getting the gospel right is absolutely essential, because it's either how do you present Christ, is it the Christ of the gospel or is it not? And I'm finding how do we encourage Christians to see that this is a fight that we need to continue fighting, because the gospel is at stake, salvation is at stake. And I'm just also, as I'm thinking that through, I'm just aware that really people aren't prepared to fight that fight anymore. And Jim Packer, for example, with Catholics and evangelicals together, it just sort of burdens me, and I don't really know how do we equip saints to prepare to stand on reformational battlegrounds, really.
Yeah, I think you're right. Well, there are several ways we can work on it. For example, in terms of our church life, remembering Reformation Sunday and making it a regular occasion, the last Sunday of October, just to remind of the importance of the issues that were raised then.
Be more liturgical in order to
be more
that's right.
Yes, that's right. And also when it comes to preaching, I know that it can be sensitive, and I don't want us to be over dedicated to critical kind of critical preaching, but it's part of our apologetic task. And so in applying the scriptures, we should also have in mind the main narratives that are presented by, say, Rome, for example, and without pointing to people necessarily, but helping our people to interpret reality according to the gospel. And so I was negatively impressed when listening to a series of sermons on Galatians, for example. And Catholicism was never mentioned in the application of, say, Galatians 1 and 2 and 4. And to me, that was a bad preaching. Not applied at all, not only in terms of reminding our historical roots. Luther would have never preached Galatians without making a point, at least in what he was saying. But even in the application, there were all other kinds of applications, but not on, say, Roman Catholicism. So there is a responsibility on the part of pastors, ministers, in order to make it part of the routine in preaching and in church life.
Anyone else in the panel want to contribute to that? We'll move on. Great, we'll move on. We've got a question here.
Hi. I was wondering, to what extent should there or not, given all these important differences, and particularly concerning salvation, should there be cooperation or a sort of mere Christianity approach in mission and evangelism and apologetics between Protestants, Eastern Orthodox and Catholics? And I'm thinking particularly in, for example, polemics with Muslims or other things like that.
Good question.
Yes. Perhaps you've seen online Andrew Wilson versus David Wood when they were talking about Jay Dyer. So Jay Dyer was taking to task a Protestant apologist against Islam, God Logic, Avery. And Jay Dyer, being Eastern Orthodox, kind of is happy for Protestants to take on Muslims, but actually will round on a kind of mere Christianity, Christian apologist against Islam, and want to know about the Filioque clause, and will want to know, like, what is your model of the Trinity? And what's been interesting is to see online people like David Wood and others kind of not able to understand why wouldn't every Eastern Orthodox and Catholic apologist just shut up about their differences and be shoulder to shoulder against Islam? And temperamentally, I would be more on, obviously, the Protestant side of things, but I saw that the Eastern Orthodox had a point. Like, if they really believe that the Western Trinity is idolatrous and a false god, then they ought to have a debate with us about whether monarchical, Trinitarianism or conciliar Trinitarianism, or like whatever model of Trinitarianism they think is the only model. We actually ought to have that very robust conversation, as well as unite where we can with Islam. And I think, but the trouble is online, you get people who have never taken a backward step in their lives, engaged in ratcheting up conversations in which they are not being helped by the other denomination, but only defining themselves in opposition to the other denomination. So is there a world in which you can learn from the best of the Cappadocians on the Trinity, as well as from Augustine on the Trinity, and appreciate the other side and name the differences? And is it possible to have that conversation that sharpens you so that when you go to Speaker's Corner and you talk to the Muslim, you're actually a better apologist? I'd love to see that. I don't think we're mature enough to do that yet, but I'd love to see that.
Dan.
I've done something on co-belligerence before. I think co-belligerence is fine. You have to be cautious. I think the other thing, though, and I sound so kind of grumpy and curmudgeonly, I know, but the ARC thing again last year, where everyone is so, all you hear from different traditions is the importance of the image of God, the image of God. I love the doctrine of the image of God, that all people have dignity, but I think that at the moment is the lowest common denominator. It's going to be interesting to know as those groups develop, when you then start talking about what sin and salvation means. At the moment, there's kind of, well, everyone has dignity because we're made in the image of God. Wow, everyone's kind of holding hands and it's brilliant. But I was thinking it is naive. I think there's a naivety. And also it's not fair on the thousands of people who have fought for these doctrines, because these are matters of life and death. And I think that's important as well. So, yeah.